Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello everyone, and welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be talking about the most time-consuming decision in D&D and Pathfinder, how to fix it and make it take less time for you. Now, there are some decisions that can take a lot of time depending on your game system, even compared to spell selection, which is our actual topic for today, hence Linda's Witch Hat. It depends on your system as well. Pathfinder 1st Edition, wild and outrageous like feat trees and multi-classing sometimes could take some time, but at least once you decided, you were done. And in some systems like Pathfinder, where you can buy a bunch of items at the store, unlike D&D 5e, you might have item shopping to do, but again, once you've bought it, at least you have it. With spells, however, not only do you have to pick your spells, but depending on your class and casting style, between being a sorcerer or a wizard or what have you, you might have to pick your spells every day. And you don't have to pick any of those other things every day.
And even if you don't need to pick things every day, you might need to make changes every time that you level up, for example.
That's right. And so, in order to choose spells quickly in a game system that could have hundreds or even thousands of options for spells, depending on which system we're talking about, how many books you have, whether you have third-party options, etc., we're going to be using the techniques of taking a big, sort of almost intractable problem that can give you analysis paralysis. We're going to cut it down into manageable chunks. We're going to look at each of those individually, show how to handle those. Once you know how to handle those, you can handle the bigger problem too. So, right away, with spell selection, there's actually 3 spell selection problems. We mentioned the episodes about spell selection, but there's 3 different ones. One of them is choosing your total repertoire of spell. If you're like a sorcerer or other spontaneous caster who chooses once and maybe you can retrain it over time barely, but mostly you're going to use that set of spells. Number 2, there is a prepared caster at the beginning of each day, picking which spells to prepare for that day. And number 3, some prepared spellcasters like wizards are also choosing spells to put in their books so that it's on the list of ones that they can then prepare for the day, which is a different selection process than either of the other 2. It's more similar to choosing for your repertoire, but it's actually pretty different.
Yeah.
So if that all seems like a lot, don't worry, because we are going to look at them one at a time.
So we can start off with the sort of spontaneous caster. This is your pool that you know.
Yes, because the repertoire is actually the easiest to deal with. Partially because also once you choose it, you don't have to mess around with it that often. And when you're looking at a repertoire for like a sorcerer or other spontaneous spellcaster, there are a few different ways to decide how you're going to choose your spells. Now, unfortunately, some of the ways that you might try to use to streamline this process and like create characters that you know from stories and fiction turn out to be mechanically weak options in D&D and Pathfinder. Now, you might decide to go for it and sort of do the self-nerf for theme, and that's all right.
So, for example, here, you might think, I'm going to build the Fire Sorcerer of Fire.
And every spell has to be fire. It's going to be Burning Hands. It's going to be Fireball. It's going to be everything that you have is going to be filled up with fire to the degree that it can be fire.
So if you're fighting in the Ice Elemental Temple of Ice and everything is weak to fire, that's great. But if you're fighting things that fire's not good against, then suddenly you've got a problem. Plus, now your spells are really offensive and damaging. So if you're fighting in an area where it's like, oh, but I don't want to start a forest fire, well, that's kind of a problem.
Even if you're just fighting in the neutral land of neutrality where everything is normal, it still wasn't a good decision, and here's why. This is a quick way to select your spells in a way that's mechanically effective. I do want to put a sidebar and say it could be cool to make a character who's thematically focused on one thing. Right now, that class is not a spellcaster in D&D or Pathfinder, at least not without significantly weakening yourself. That class would be like a Pathfinder kineticist or elemental avatar, but you could consider working with your GM to be like, hey GM, my sorcerer is literally only going to take fire spells. Can we homebrew some buffs that I can gain as like a set bonus for this? Because I'm weakening myself. So, sidebar over. Let's talk about how to not weaken yourself and quickly select your spells. The way that you want to do this is to do the exact opposite of taking all fire spells. You want to start with the spell you're most excited about. Let's say that it is Fireball, because you love fire. And you're like, okay, great. So I have Fireball. I'm going to cast that a lot of the time. Whether it's using the D&D system and just casting it in the higher slots no matter what for a pretty small amount of extra damage, or the Pathfinder system where you would have to choose it as a signature spell and you get a lot of extra damage for casting it in your higher slots. Either way, Fireball is going to be our answer to a lot of questions. So what that means is, though, since we know we have Fireball, maybe we can take one other damaging spell for if it's the fire immune enemy, and it'll be not fire. It'll be like ice or lightning or something. And then after that, we love Fireball. It's a good spell. So we're not going to take any other damaging spells that kind of compete with Fireball. Instead, we take our favorite from these sub-buckets. We take the bigger problem and we break it into smaller problems. So we chose Fireball as our damage spell. And then maybe Lightning Bolt or something like that is our backup damage spell. So then the rest of our slots, we're going to try to fill different roles. Things that you would want at a time that you don't want Fireball or even anything like Fireball.
So one of the key roles that you might be thinking about are like utility spells that are going to allow your character to move or act in a different kind of way. Like, flying or things that are buffing you, like haste and things like that.
Exactly. Think of something that at a time when you don't need Fireball, you might need. For instance, in Pathfinder, a druid could have Fireball on the primal list, but they could also have Heal, a spell that you might need at a different time than Fireball. So if you split all the spells apart into like healing and condition removal, damage, buffs, and debuffs, then you can be like, well, I'd like to have one good one of each. And you can therefore be looking at each of them one at a time. So let's say there were 30 spells you could take, but actually of those 30 spells, like 4 of them were damaging, and 5 of them were buffs, and 4 of them were debuffs. If you break them down like that, and you try to take one from each category, and maybe you can't fit all the categories, because you only have 4 spells and there were 6 categories, it's easier to decide than when you just have the undifferentiated list of 30 spells.
But then you might take a look at things and be like, okay, let's take a look at what I picked. You're probably picking spells level by level as you level up. You may take a look at, like, what did I pick at last level? Alright, I actually have, like, a lot of cool utility stuff at last level that's still useful. So maybe I'm going to focus more on, taking a new damage thing. And as you consider sort of the scope of your spells, another thing to keep in mind is not just the damage type that you're doing, but also the sort of the defense that enemies are going to have against what you're doing. So let's say that you have a whole suite of spells and you're like, great, I've got command and I've got like spells that do mental damage and I've got all these kinds of things,
and they're all will saves in Pathfinder or wisdom saves in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
You might want to look for something that's a different defense, so that an enemy that's good at their will save or their wisdom save is not suddenly your Achilles heel that all your spells don't work against. That's the same principle of diversifying and trying to get spells that are good in different situations than the ones you currently have. And here's the thing. You want them to be good in different situations, and as a spontaneous spellcaster, you want them to be something that you are likely to cast on any given day if their situation comes up. So not something that's so unusual that you don't usually need it. In that case, it might be better to just grab a scroll or some other consumable item for the off chance that, like, if every 10 days in game you need to cast it once, and maybe on that day you need to cast it twice or whatever, you could just get a couple of scrolls and whenever you're in town replace either of the 2 scrolls if they've been used.
To go back to the idea of spell diversification, in addition to sort of spell roll as well as the defense that is involved, another consideration is the range of the spell.
Yes.
You can definitely have situations where you're like, well, I have all these spells, but all of my spells are like touch range or at most 30 feet, and then opponents are farther than 30 feet away, and then you're like, well, I can't do anything.
Now, it's actually not a problem if all of your spells have a ridiculously long range.
Yes.
unless they're weaker because of the fact they have the longer range and it's like prorated into their effects, then maybe you want to get something stronger that is at close range. If you're talking spells like Fireball, which are like consistently good spells and have an obnoxiously long range, then it's like, okay, you can never have too many of those. But as Linda said, if all your spells are like, if they're more than 15 feet from me, I cannot use any of my spells, then you're going to be in a dicey situation.
Yeah.
You might want to try to find
another
range.
limit that you may want to consider is if the spells have some kind of limitation or factor that makes them a little more situational in when you can cast them, you're going to want to watch for not having too many that fit that same limitation. So to think about that from sort of the Pathfinder, the Pathfinder 2nd edition perspective, spells that take 3 actions to cast are going to be something that's going to be more limited in when you can use it. Or like if you had a spell that's like, hey, I have an expensive material component cost, or some other thing that's going on where you're not going to always be able to use that thing. You're probably not going to want to have a lot of spells that are competing for that same space.
Maybe one, especially if it's really good for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's not to say never take them, but once you have one, you might be like, okay, do I really need 2 different spells that take 3 actions to cost, or that are going to use my crystal points that I only have a certain number of per day, or things like that.
Exactly. So now, those are our best tips to quickly decide your sorcerer spells. Break it down into smaller subsets, make your spells more different in the defenses and in what they do. If you are a wizard or any other type of spellcaster that needs to build some kind of book or other list of spells that they then prepare, if you start with the core of your book being almost exactly the same as the way that you would work on this sorcerer repertoire. But the wizard can have far more things in their book than that. And so as a wizard, you also want to look for the types of spells that you know that you need them when you need them. That way, you don't have to get a million scrolls of everything, because you're like, okay, if we're doing an underwater adventure and we need water breathing, I will know.
Water breathing, yes.
I will usually know. Maybe not. Maybe just suddenly you're in the dungeon. It's like, well, the next part's underwater. We had no way to know this. But most of the time...
And there's time pressure and you can't...
Yes, and we can't rest for the night. Most of the time, if you need water breathing, you really, really need water breathing. And you usually know it's like, oh, we're going to the sunken temple underwater. Yeah. So... that's a great one to have in your book.
Or like a spell about understanding language, or being able to speak languages that you wouldn't know otherwise.
So like we're going to another country where they don't speak common. Yeah. Maybe we need that.
Or like a spell about being able to do long distance travel. Maybe you don't need that every day, but it's going to be super useful to you on some adventures. Or like a spell that defends against a circumstance that, is relatively common but doesn't happen every day. Like, maybe you didn't want to take resist energy type stuff as your sorcerer because you say, well, I only have so many spells and I don't feel like taking it. But as your wizard, you're probably going to want to have that for the fire dungeon of fire.
Yep. Or, it's like we're approaching the ice dragon tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's like, well, let's get something to protect against cold. So... all of these considerations of things that you could reasonably predict that you need in advance are the kinds of things that you would want to have added to your book on top of the things that a sorcerer might want.
And in that case, when it comes to, say, damage types, you probably are going to want to diversify more and say, okay, I'm going to want to have a way to do fire damage and cold damage and electricity damage and... these sorts of things.
Do not just pick 2 like the sorcerer would for your 2 top tier damage spells. Get one of each, because why not?
And when you do that, try to look at having a variety of defenses. So it's like, okay, well, I have a choice between doing an AC spell for defended spell for my lightning or a reflex spell, but I already have a lot of reflex defense spells, so maybe I'll do one that defends against AC. So that way, later on when you're picking, it's going to be easier for you if you have more toggles and different things going on.
Yes, although I will point out that for wizards, it can be difficult to actually predict at the preparation stage that day's adventure is going to need reflex saves or dexterity saves for you D&D people, because you don't know exactly what you're fighting. But wizards, just like sorcerers, you want to have a mix of things in your list that you actually have for the day, which we haven't gotten into yet completely, but we're sort of bridging the gap into
Yeah, well, I
so
was going to get
they're-
a little too much into it, but I think that, what I was saying, it'll be useful for later if you have yourself set up to be able to create sets that will be useful later on.
And just in the same way that we already said for the sorcerer that you should have a variety of defenses that you're targeting, same is definitely true for the spellbook, and you have more space to do it. With the sorcerer, it might not be easy to actually pick up all the defenses. With a wizard, you probably can.
There's also something else that's been mentioned in chat that that has implications on both of these, but especially the one we talked about before and the one we'll talk about later, which is what the other people in your group are doing.
Yes, that can be helpful, because if we said let's cover these different roles and maybe there's 6 different types of spells, but we only can choose 4. If one of those 6 was healing that we were thinking about, and then we found out we had the healing cleric of healing was one of our other, we're the druid still, we had fireball as one, and we're like, well, should I get heal? Maybe you still should, just to be a backup healer, but if you have the healing cleric of healing and they're like, I'm a heal bot, I'm gonna heal every turn, then that gives you less pressure to have healing as well.
Or if like you have someone who's going to be giving a status, always going to be giving people a status bonus to a particular thing, then maybe, or like a specific bonus that doesn't like stack with the bonus that you're doing.
Right, like if you have this exact same buff spell as somebody else and it affects the entire party, then there's not really too much of a point in having that overlap. Especially if you know it's one of their favorites to cast, you can back down and prepare something else. It all depends on negotiation and talking to the rest of your group.
Yeah,
in that
or like
regard.
let's say that someone in your group has decided, you know what, forget everything else, I'm playing the Fire Sorcerer of Fire. You might decide, I don't actually need any fire spells, because if fire's what we need, Fire Sorcerer of Fire has it covered.
If anything, they're dragging us down a little by literally only having fire, so we really need to cover everything else, because they are not covering their share of anything except for fire. So it would probably be pretty bad if I had a good amount of fire too.
And I also saw a mention of how you can maintain a theme while still including
your theme.
spells. Yeah.
Your theme just can't be that I'm all fire spells. Your theme can be like, I'm theming on the element of fire, and to me that also means stoking and enkindling the heart with courage and bravado or rage and anger. So things that buff strength and damage, I'm gonna say, are fiery. Like, you can do that, but they can't you just do not want them all to literally be fire damage.
Yeah.
Alright, so we've got our spellbook. That was actually the hard part for the wizard, is getting your spellbook, because there's a lot of things to do, but preparing each day is potentially the most tedious part, because unlike both of the other 2 things that we just talked about, this is something that theoretically you have the power and ability, and some would say, if you're someone like me who sometimes gets anxious that you need to be performing well for your group, the responsibility to be preparing your spells appropriately for each day. In some ways, that's a chain and not just a freedom. So when you're looking at this, you want to pick a group of spells for that day out of your spellbook that has some of the same properties we talked about for the repertoire. So why we did the sorcerer repertoire first is that both of the 2 things for wizards share some aspects. So you want to have a mix of defenses and a mix of different types of spells, just as before. However, you can use the knowledge of what the heck you're doing, unless it's just like you have no idea, to decide what you're preparing that day.
So you're probably going to want to start by constructing a few different bog standard default lists.
What do I prepare when I'm just in town and I have no indication we're going on an adventure?
What do I prepare when we're going on an adventure, but I have no idea what is going to be there?
Exactly. And once you know what that default list is for both of those 2 situations, that will have you covered almost no matter what you run into. And if you run into an adventure where you do have more information, you can start with one of your default lists, and then you just sort of substitute out certain spells to add new ones in. Usually you won't immediately be able to tell which ones to take out, unless it's like, well, things that we know we're fighting are going to be immune to this. Usually it's more that you'll find a few that you want to add
Yeah.
that because of what you know you're going up against, and then you'll say, well, which ones can I get rid of? Seeing what I added, and maybe what I added were all defended against by the same defense. Maybe I'll cut some that were defended by that defense.
So, for example, in a case when you may know what to remove, let's go back to you're adventuring underwater. You might need some magic for both breathing underwater and also helping people maneuver underwater.
But
fireball is not going to be as effective. So, you can remove that, but if you only remove that and then you don't have another offense, you could have an issue. So you're going to want to make sure you still are fulfilling a balanced set of roles.
So you start with something that you know, and you make the changes that are necessary, but don't go overboard. You don't have to re-examine and do like a long thought about every spell that's on your list. Just look through other spells in your book and see if there are ones you really want to add, and then maybe glance at the list and see if there's something that obviously doesn't make any sense. And then other than that, you're in good shape and you're ready to go.
Another thing that you may want to consider doing is you might say, well, I have a lot of spells in my book, or I just learned a new spell, I want to try something new. But that doesn't mean you need to, overhaul everything. You might be, hey, I just learned a cool new blast spell. I'm going to replace my preparation of one of my blast spells that I have already with this one. Or I just learned a cool new... Then replace something that's doing a similar role, and then you can try it out without having to go back to the drawing board completely.
The one saving grace of having to do this every day is that at least if you're a wizard, you're doing it from a spell book that's limited. So at least there's, you learned 8 spells of that rank. There's only 8 choices. Now, there is no saving grace for the prepared classes that have the misfortune and fortune of preparing from the entire spell list that anyone ever publishes ever.
Yes.
For example, in Pathfinder, the cleric and the druid, any common spell that is ever published, even if it's in some obscure book, even if it's published by a third party and your group is using that, no matter what, they all have them instantly. It's just sort of sent into your brain when Paizo publishes a new book. And obviously, your group may want to curate things, even if they're not uncommon or rare. We do that too in our home group. But the standard default is that it just gets harder and harder to decide your spells as a cleric or druid as new books come out. So how do you deal with this?
So first of all, I would recommend when you're picking, even if the game doesn't force you to limit your sources, try to start by limiting your sources as a default. So you might say, okay, I'm going to start by just looking at spells in the core rulebook, or, player core 1 and 2. And then if there's something that I'm thinking, hey, I really can't achieve XYZ that I'm trying to do, then you can branch out for that thing in particular.
Right.
Or you might be like, hey, I got a new book and I think it's cool and I'm looking through it and my favorite spell that I see in this book is this. Or, I pick a few spells that I think are cool and then I'm going to try to bring them into the system. Rather than like sitting down, because I think one of the most overwhelming things is if you do like Archives of Nethys search or whatever and you're like, list all of the spells of this level, and then you're just like,
here's 70 spells.
Yeah, it's just a lot. So, like, instead of trying to internalize everything at once, try to start with a familiarity with, like, the core rulebook style baseline, and then gradually take a look at some of the things from other sources and think about what you might want to incorporate.
Mad Guy Dave points out this is an easier task the fewer spells you have. So if you're someone who's playing, say, D&D 5e, and you're not adding a lot of additional content from third parties because Wizards didn't publish that many books.
Yeah.
You don't have as many spells to go through. And not only that, he pointed out that there are several of each spell level for given classes that are just like kind of brokenly better than the other ones that are well known by the community. Now, you might not be a member of that community who already knows those things. So one thing that you can do, and I stress this is the last thing you should do, and maybe you shouldn't do it at all, is if you just really don't know where to start, or you're thinking that, like that guy Dave said, maybe there's some busted spells that are by far the best that you should be looking at, but you don't know it because you haven't been in that community, you could go and try to find somebody's list of, like, the spells to look at as a way to winnow it down. I recommend not doing that and instead taking a look through the spells yourself to see what will be useful for you, because of the fact that often those lists are very focused on the playstyle of the person who's making them. But if you have no idea where to go, it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
And it will usually find you something that, at least for that play style, is very useful. Probably will at least be pretty useful for you.
Mm-hmm.
So it is something you can do, but that's the step you should take last after you've done all these other things.
Yeah.
Is possibly look for someone else to tell you which spells are ones to take a look at, and then that doesn't mean you find someone's tier list and see what is S tier and then prepare only that in alphabetical order. That just means those are ones to consider while you're doing the advice from this video and trying to have different categories of spells for different situations.
You might, for example, pick one of those spells to be the starting point for building a diverse array of spells.
Usually people who are doing things like that have, no matter what your playstyle is, they usually are pretty accurate on the damaging spells because they'll crunch the math for you. So at the very least, if you're deciding between maybe there's like, say, 9 damaging spells that you could have, and then you decided to watch this video, mostly not for the damaging spells or whatever reason, and you look at their list of spells, and one of the ones you were deciding between was ranked F tier, and they're like, it's F tier because it does 10 damage, and all the other ones do 100.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, maybe I should take that off the list of ones that I'm considering because it does 10 damage and the other ones do 100. And I'll only consider the other 8. So it can definitely at least be a way to open your eyes if there's a very extreme value being given to one of them, especially if it's low and it was on your list of considerations.
Yeah.
However, keep in mind that those kind of rankings usually do things very mathematically, very damage-based, and can wind up giving a low rating to the kind of spells you might actually need for utility or in other situations.
I wanted to go back a little bit when I was talking about looking at sort of the whole entire list and going through lots of sources. Limiting the sources can be useful when doing the sorcerer style thing too, but I think it's a bit less necessary because in that case, if you're preparing, say, only because you're picking one new spell whenever you level up, and you're doing that between sessions, that's a lot less pressure than like, oh, every single day my character has to prep their list.
Yes, and when I say that those lists that you can find tend to be very sort of mathematical and they can be focused on damage, that's not to say that the lists claim that damage is the most powerful spells. In fact, often, depending on the game system you're playing, there are instant win spells that are rated much higher than damage. Damage sometimes is one of the lower rated things because you actually have to play the game of numbers as it's intended rather than just win instantly. So keep that all in mind, but you should be able to find at least if something is way, way at an extreme that you might not need to consider it as much.
And I would say then, once you have your list, at the end of with a spellcaster, it's useful at the end of the session to think about how is that list going for you? You know, did there spells you had fun casting? Are there spells that you have on your default list that you realize you have never cast in 6 sessions?
Try what you do, like when you have your list of spells, probably you're putting tally marks or a check mark, or if it's online, it's crossing it off for you or whatever. There's some record keeping that you had to do to figure out which spells you would use. So try to keep a permanent record of the ones that you're using. And that way, you'll know after several sessions and be like, hey, so I knew I loved Fireball, and indeed, I did cast a lot of Fireballs. But I wound up casting this haste that I put in there actually an awful lot. And the lightning bolt I had as a backup, I almost never used. But the time that I know that I only marked it twice in 4 sessions, but the times I used it was very important because they were immune to fire. And then I've got this other spell on here that I put in that was a sound mind to try to help against like mental effects and remove them, and we never use that at all. Maybe I don't need sound mind, or maybe it should be a scroll or something like that, because honestly, or maybe I'm like, no, I'm keeping it because while I didn't need it, having weird mind effects up on my party members is so bad if it actually happens.
But it's
like,
okay, you know, that was because we were fighting in the wolf den and there wasn't anything that did mind effects. But whenever we go to the land of the brainworms next, then we're going to want that.
That's right.
There's a question. Did you talk about the difference with deciding to prepare the same spell multiple times?
Okay. So when you are playing an Advancian style caster, such as a Pathfinder wizard, for example, or wizards from earlier editions of D&D, you will need to potentially prepare the same spell multiple times. Well, fortunately, the decision of whether to do that or not is part of the exact same process as preparing spells if you didn't have to prepare the same spell multiple times. In general, you're making the same decisions for diversity, just this time when you're saying, okay, I know I have a certain number of slots per day. Let's say I have a total of 20 across various spell ranks, and I wanted to fill up 4 of those with attack spells. Now, you would say, okay, well, one of them is going to be a fireball. But you might almost say, well, what about the second one? Will that be a second fireball? Well, maybe it's a lightning bolt. All right, the third one, though, is that going to be a some kind of acid or cold spell, or the second fireball? So you take into account the diversity of what spells you have, while also considering that repeating your favorite spell is one of your choices.
Yeah. And if you're playing in a system like 3.5 or Pathfinder First Edition, where you might be saying, okay, well, I want to make sure that everyone has this particular buff spell, then you might have a thing where you're like, all right, spellcasters in the group, there are 6 characters, and we want to make sure that everyone has Barkskin. So who's preparing Barkskin? I'll prepare 2 of the Barkskin. Each of us 3 characters will each prepare 2 of the Barkskins.
Now we know we have 6.
Now we know we have 6 Barkskins. And then I think that in those systems, default spell lists are even more crucial because you're trying to cover a more complicated list of like pre-buffs and things like that. And then you would probably, in those kinds of systems, you probably want to have a set where everybody has their default list, and you know, if everyone uses their default list, we have this set of buffs that goes on every character before every combat, and then everybody has their little buff package, and then you're not spending nearly so long with that kind of thing.
In those kinds of systems with pre-buffs, it can easily take hours or even an entire session just to prepare your
We had
spell.
that for the final, even with our usual strategies for like the final campaign fight for Rise of the Rune Lords, because we were trying to tweak everything.
Yeah, that was wild. But this is how we learned these techniques to save yourself time, because we have been in games where a lot of time was taken. And even using those techniques, a lot of time was taken. It probably would have taken multiple sessions to prepare the spells if our group had not used these techniques. So, to summarize, you want to treat every different way of selecting spells as different, because they each have their own distinctive restrictions and benefits. They have their distinctive timings, and they have their distinctive opportunity costs and ways to sort of swap them out later. When you do, split the problem of all the spells into smaller buckets of trying to cover all your bases by having spells for different situations, especially if you're the type of caster like a sorcerer or a flexible prepared caster like in Secrets of Magic for Pathfinder or in 5e in general for the prepared casters, where you can just kind of do whatever you want with your slots. In those cases, you definitely want to try to cover your bases so that you are better in different situations rather than repeat similar spells.
Speaking of repeating, consider what the other members of your party have very well covered, as well as the large gaps in what other members of your party can accomplish.
Because as a unit, your party also wants to try to cover all of its bases in the same way that you, as an individual spellcaster, do too. Then think about which kinds of things are most important to have repeated in case the other person can't do it. Healing is one of the top answers to that question, because the often reason that the other person can't do it is that they need healing.
Yes. Also, like if you had someone who's like, okay, I have a bunch of different damage dealing spells, then you wouldn't want to be like, well, I have no ways to deal damage. I'm only utility spells.
That's right. But if they have a bunch of damage dealing spells that are all fire, and that all go against reflex or dexterity saves, then you might want to have all of your damage dealing spells be all not fire and go against different defenses if you can help it. So you consider it on the grounds of yourself and the other characters. Split things apart. Try to create subgroupings that'll make it easier to look through and decide, because it's much easier to decide between 5 things 6 times, where you're trying to maybe select one thing off of 4 of the 6 lists, than it is to select 4 things off of just a list of 30 undifferentiatedly. Always break the problem down into smaller problems. You'll be done it much faster.
once you have your list written down and you see them in play, take a moment to think about how the experience of using those spells was. Are there ones that you loved and you used all the time? Great. Are there ones that you weren't using and haven't used in a while? Then it's worth thinking about, are they something that you want to keep on that list? Are they something maybe you just want to use on a scroll? Or are they something that you want to swap out for something else?
So there you have it. That's the TLDR of our tips for you. Hopefully with these, you'll be able to breeze through, or at least maybe it won't be breeze, like for us in that one example where it still took a session, but you'll at least be able to shave off probably half to 3/4 of the preparation time by making the problem easier and less daunting and breaking it down.
To be fair, we had a 17th level cleric, a 17th level mystic surge, and a 17th level eldritch knight all preparing their spells.
That is true.
Among other things.
That doesn't make you like more spells on average than an average 3.5 or Pathfinder 1.
No, I know, but we were like, who's gonna, like, the mystic surge could prepare, to what balance of cleric versus wizard spells is the mystic surge going to do?
That's right. All right, so everyone, please like and subscribe, and if you would and you want to support us, you can join us. We've got a vote for next Tuesday, but be sure to catch us on Saturday when we will have the day after its release, because we got an early copy of it, Dawnsbury Days.
It looks like Matt Guy already voted for 3, so we have a first vote on our poll.
That's right. So Saturday is going to be our Dawnsbury Days expansion pack. I don't know if it's going to continue. Probably it will with our 5th level under treasured because we spent it all on consumables for the last fight group, or if it's going to switch things up.
Oh, I want to point out something else from chat. There's a note. When playing, take notes on what you wished you had a particular type of spell so you're ready to level up. And you're like, oh man, I wish I had this.
That's part of the same note-taking process is when you note which ones you did use, note which ones you could have used, and note which scrolls you are continually replacing. That'll probably be the easiest, because depending on how your party does money, everyone's going to be looking at you when you keep asking for money to replace the scroll.
There's a point that we missed. Well, yeah, we missed Katrina's vote up before,
yes,
and then there's another 3
threes.
and another 3, and everyone voted 3, so it's 3.
All right. So
3 GM tools, in-game time pressure. Let's give XP to all of our viewers.
Yes. So we're gonna give some XP here at the end, and then that'll be it. All right, you've got your XP. So have a good week. We will see you either on Saturday for Dawnsbury Days or on Tuesday for in-game time pressure.
Or whenever else you feel like joining us.
Or maybe never if you're like, I don't know, I wanted to know about preparing spells, but that's it. All right.